The smell of the Thames in the 18th century was a mixture of salt water, damp wood, coal smoke, and something far more disturbing, the slow, rotting stench of hopelessness. If you stood on the riverbank at dawn, when the fog hung low and the gulls circled silently, you might have seen them. Massive wooden ships with broken masts, stripped rigging, and blackened hulls. They did not sail. They did not move. They simply drifted, like ghosts chained to the shoreline. These were the British prison hulks, the floating nightmares of the Empire. Ships once built for glory, now turned into cages for the abandoned, the damned, and the forgotten. And what happened inside their dark decks would become one of the most horrifying chapters in Britain's criminal history. You're watching Biography Plus. It began with a crisis. By the late 1700s, British prisons were overflowing. Crime was rising, cities were growing, and punishments that once terrified thieves, like public hangings, were losing their power. The government needed space. Space to punish, space to contain, space to make examples of those who dared defy the crown. But building new prisons was expensive, slow, and unpopular. Yet, right there, anchored in harbors from London to Portsmouth, lay the solution. Decommission the naval warships, too old or too damaged to sail, but still strong enough to hold human lives inside their wooden ribs. And so, the hulks were born. At first, the idea sounded simple. Put prisoners on old ships, keep them there, make them work, discipline them, reform them. But nothing about the hulks remained simple for long. Within months, they transformed into floating hells, places where thousands of men suffered, starved, sickened, and died sometimes within weeks of arriving. Imagine this. You are 15 years old, sentenced to 7 years for stealing bread to feed your mother. A small crime, a desperate crime, but the judge sends you not to prison, but to the hulks. Shackles are clamped around your ankles. A guard drags you down a creaking wooden ramp toward a ship blackened with mold, its windows sealed, its lower decks dripping with filth. As you step inside, the smell hits you. Sweat, sickness, sewage, and death. You have entered a world that does not care if you ever leave. Life on the hulks was a daily fight against disease. The decks were overcrowded. Men slept chained together, lying on damp straw that crawled with lice. Rats scurried freely, sometimes eating the leather straps of the prisoners' shoes, and sometimes eating worse. The smell of unwashed bodies, mixed with rotting food, created air so thick that even the guards covered their faces. But disease was only half the horror. The other half was punishment. The British believed the hulks were not just prisons, they were lessons. Every prisoner was a warning to the rest of society. This is what happens if you step out of line. Corporal punishment was constant. Whipping was common. The cut-o' nine tails, with its barbed ends, ripped open skin, and left wounds that rarely healed in the damp, infected air. Guards patrolled the decks with clubs, striking anyone who moved too slowly or who dared to speak out of turn. Men who disobeyed could be chained to the hull in freezing water for hours. Some were starved. Some were locked inside coffin-like boxes. Others were hung by their wrists until their shoulders cracked. And yet, these punishments were considered normal. But perhaps the cruelest act was that prisoners were forced each day to row ashore like chained animals, forced to labor for the very government that condemned them. They dredged rivers, hauled stones, dug canals, and cleared filth, all under the eye of armed guards. Villagers who watched often turned their faces away. The sight was too painful to bear, as one British observer wrote. Their faces are pale, their bodies thin, their eyes hollow. They look less like men, more like shadows waiting to fade. Death came quickly on the hulks. Cholera spread through the cramped decks like wildfire. Typhus thrived in the filth. Malnutrition weakened bodies until they could not stand. Some prisoners drowned while trying to escape their chains. Others simply died in the night. Their bodies were taken ashore at dawn and buried in unmarked graves, forgotten as soon as the dirt covered them. And yet, the hulks continued to fill. They became the dumping grounds for the Empire's unwanted petty thieves. Debtors, vagrants, rebels, even children. Some boys as young as 9 were sentenced to years aboard these floating prisons. Their crimes were often no more than hunger. But not everyone on the hulks was guilty. Many were awaiting trial. Some were wrongly convicted. A few were political prisoners, Irish rebels, radicals, men who spoke against the government. To the British, justice was efficiency. To the prisoners, it was despair. By the early 1800s, the hulks had grown into a massive system. Hundreds of ships along British coasts held thousands of inmates. The government insisted they were improving society. In reality, the hulks were killing men faster than courts could condemn them. And then came the most shocking part of all, the hulks' connection to transportation. Britain had long exiled prisoners to America and later to Australia, but the hulks acted as holding cells for those waiting to be shipped across oceans. Prisoners sat for months, sometimes years, in darkness before being marched onto transport ships. Many arrived in Australia so weak and sick that they died within days, and the people living in those colonies knew exactly where these men had come from, the floating coffins of England. But if the hulks were so horrible, why did they last so long? Because they were cheap. Brutally cheap. It cost the government almost nothing to convert an old warship into a prison. Guards were poorly paid, discipline was absolute, and the prisoners had no rights. The hulks made punishment efficient, they made suffering convenient. They kept crime visible. We must never forget, they were designed to be seen. The government wanted people to look at them. The hulks were warnings, floating warnings. Yet as the years passed, voices began to rise against them. Religious groups, doctors, journalists, and even some politicians began to expose the horrors. Reports leaked, describing conditions so dreadful that even hardened sailors were shocked. One investigator wrote, "This is not a place of punishment. This is a place of death." Another called the hulks the shame of the empire. Slowly, public pressure grew. By the mid-1800s, a movement began to demand the hulks be closed forever. But even then, the British government resisted. Removing the hulks meant spending money and admitting they were wrong. In the end, it wasn't morality that defeated the hulks. It was disease. A cholera outbreak linked directly to a hulk ship forced the government to act. Slowly, one by one, the hulks were emptied. Some were burned. Some were dismantled. Others were left to rot until the sea swallowed them. When the last hulk closed in the mid-1800s, the nightmare was finally over, but the damage was permanent. Tens of thousands had passed through the hulks. Many died nameless. Many survived but were scarred for life. Some were shipped to Australia and became ancestors of modern families. Some disappeared into history entirely. And today, most people have never heard their story. But the rivers of Britain remember. The harbors remember. The sea remembers the cries that echoed inside those wooden walls. And now, so do we. The floating prisons of the British Empire were not just ships, they were warnings carved into the water, reminders that societies can drift into cruelty without even noticing. You've been watching Biography Plus. If you believe history still speaks, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.